Well, I understand that Cecilia Malmström was serenaded this morning. Right. I'm not sure there's anyone who wants to repeat the performance, but I saw the words that were sung today, and it's remarkable how TTIP has become such a household word, and how people are getting so excited by a transatlantic trade deal. But it's, very good to be here. Thank you, Rector, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here at the College of Europe. I've been here before. Unfortunately, I wasn't a student here. I made a terrible mistake. I didn't come and study here at the college. You know that many alumni of the college have had stellar careers, including in the U.S. mission to the European Union. George Shultz, who was our Secretary of State many years ago, several decades ago, apparently would call all of the newly appointed ambassadors to his office. And he would call them over to a big globe in the side of his office. And he would ask them, please point at the country, at your country. And almost invariably, they would point their finger at the country of their destination. And he would say, no, that's not your country. He would point the finger at the United States. He says, that's your country, and don't ever forget it. Well, I've never forgotten that, but when I arrived in Brussels 18 months ago, I felt a bit of a native. Rector mentioned a few reasons why. I was lucky enough to be a stagiaire and then DG4 in competition policy. I got interested in the European Union at Columbia Law School, and it became quickly a passion. And it was during those years of my graduate studies that I arrived at conclusions that were opposite to those of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in her Bruges speech. And I continue to believe that greater European integration has been positive for Europe and for transatlantic relations. And my convictions have grown over the years. As I mentioned, my experiences in Brussels and then at the White House, which Rector was proud enough to mention. And here I am 20 years later. Now, one of my predecessors, Stu Eisenstadt, former U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, recently described the EU as the greatest, most successful experiment in world history. In binding together a former war-torn continent into a peaceful, democratic, free-market, tolerant group of member states through shared and pooled sovereignty and mutual respect. And I fully subscribe to that description. And I think it's important to state that up front, because Europe is afflicted with self-doubt these days about the future of the Union, and we all know the difficult challenges that it faces. But we shouldn't forget how many countries are lining up to become members. We shouldn't forget how many millions of people are desperate to flee to Europe, precisely because it's a beacon of hope and opportunity. And as you mentioned, when I was at the White House, I served as a Director for European Affairs, and I worked on this new transatlantic agenda. And what we tried to do was to write a document intended to provide a detailed, action-oriented plan for U.S.-EU cooperation, replacing ad hoc reactions to occasional transatlantic frictions, which has been basically what had happened before. And if I had to write a new version of the NTA today, in 2015, it might start something like this. The United States and Europe are united by common values, guiding our work together in pursuit of shared goals. Economic and social prosperity for citizens on both sides of the Atlantic. Upholding the rule of law and strong democracies. Meeting humanitarian needs in our borders and around the world. Countering extremism and advancing peace and stability worldwide. Now, those goals are very similar to those that we expressed 20 years ago. And in some areas, we fell short of ambitions, and I'll mention them. In some areas, we succeeded. And tonight, I'd just like to review what we accomplished and what I think we should be thinking about for the next 20 years. So, past 20 years, relatively quickly. One goal of the NTA was to promote peace and stability, democracy and development around the world. Now, let's face it, we were overly optimistic about our ability to partner with Russia. Over the past 20 years, we tried to integrate Russia into the international system, from inviting them to join the Council of Europe and the OSCE in the 1990s, to President Obama's championing Russia's candidacy for the WTO. We didn't succeed. And unfortunately, the Putin regime sees the presence of democracies and Western values at its borders as a threat. The regime is popular today, clearly, but lies eventually collapse from their own weight. And over time, I am convinced that the Russian people will see how the Kremlin's policies are dramatically damaging Russia's own interests. We failed to build a partnership with Russia, but against all predictions to the contrary, the United States and the European Union did succeed in maintaining, have succeeded in maintaining, unified pressure on Russia through coordinated sanctions. And the US-EU partnership did succeed in its mission of promoting peace and stability in the Balkans, a region that in 1995 was, as we all remember, ravaged by war and ethnic conflict. The appeal of EU and NATO membership, aided by US engagement and assistance, has been a transformative political and economic force. The United States and the EU have provided money, technical support for democratic reforms, rule of law, and counter-corruption efforts in the transition to market economy. That was the first goal. Second goal, we identified in the NTA, was responding to global challenges such as fighting drug trafficking and terrorism, meeting the needs of refugees, addressing climate change, combating disease. We've had a long, strong bilateral cooperation with many EU member states on law enforcement. I'll come to that in a second because I want to underline bilateral with EU member states on law enforcement. And our cooperation on justice and home affairs obviously assumed greater importance after 9/11. That was the second goal. Third goal identified by the NTA was expanding world trade and closer economic relations. And here we can claim some success. The US and EU have worked closely over the past 20 years with the WTO, including on the recent breakthrough, to significantly expand the coverage of the information technology agreement that eliminates tariffs on $1 trillion worth of trade, $1 trillion worth of trade in high-tech products. The US and the EU also are spearheading negotiations on the environmental goods agreement to eliminate tariffs on, for example, solar panels, wind turbines, water treatment equipment, and other environmental goods. And we're leading the way on the trade and services agreement that aims to open up markets and improve rules in areas such as licensing, financial services, telecoms, e-commerce, and so forth. Now, we haven't made as much progress, it's true, on US-EU free trade, but we did establish a transatlantic economic partnership in 1998 to address obstacles to trade and pave the way for mutual recognition on goods and services. We improved transatlantic regulatory cooperation and set up the transatlantic business dialogue, directly mentioned, to bring our business communities closer together and have them propose to our government specific trade liberalization measures. And of course, we launched TTIP. As I mentioned, it's gotten so much attention. Now, this is more than just a trade deal. This is a strategic choice, and I won't get into what we're trying to do. You heard from Cecilia, I think, today. All I'll say is this: if the United States and Europe want to strengthen our respected economic power and extend our strategic influence during uncertain times, we must make a decision together. Either we lead on global trade, or we'll be left on the sidelines. There is no other choice. Now, another area mentioned in the NTA economic chapter continues to be debated: the goal of facilitating information flows while addressing the risks to privacy. I never thought when I took this job that I would be the Chief Privacy Officer of the US government here in the EU. In the year 2000, in collaboration with the European Commission, we reached an agreement on establishing the US-EU Safe Harbor Framework, many of you have perhaps heard about it, that allows personal data to be transferred from the territory of the EU to the United States while providing privacy protections. And many companies, not just US, also European companies, benefit from this safe harbor. We understand Europeans' concern about data privacy. By the way, it's not just Europeans' concerns, it's Americans' concerns. It's not you versus us. Europeans care about privacy, Americans don't. You know what? There's been a huge attention paid to this issue in the United States, with a lot of reforms made in the last 18 months. President Obama recognized that given the power and scope of our signals intelligence activities, we need to do more to reassure the world that we treat, I'm quoting, all persons with dignity and respect, regardless of their nationality or where they might reside, that we provide appropriate protection for the legitimate privacy interests of all persons in the handling of their personal information. And so we have now put into place express limits on the retention and dissemination of personal information about non-U.S. persons collected by signals intelligence, comparable to the limits we have for U.S. persons. And I took I can say, a leading role one of those efforts, which is the Judicial Redress Act. Now, against the backdrop of these unprecedented actions, we were disappointed in the European Court of Justice's recent opinion in the so-called Schrems case a few weeks ago, which creates a significant uncertainty for both U.S. and EU companies and consumers. It puts at risk the thriving transatlantic digital economy. We believe, in fact, unusually, perhaps uniquely, we stated that the decision was based on incorrect assumptions about data privacy protections in the United States. What can I tell you? The last 2 years, we've worked very closely with the European Commission to strengthen this framework and to provide robust and transparent protection with peer oversight, and we're very close. And we will continue to work with the Commission, and I believe we will have an announcement soon. That's the last 20 years. What about the next 20 years? The United States and the EU will need to increase their focus on a number of challenges mentioned in that document 20 years ago. First, climate change. One key example of our climate cooperation must be securing a new climate agreement in Paris at the end of this year. The United States is on a path toward achieving its 2020 target of a 70% reduction below 2005 levels, and we announced our ambitious post-2020 target at the end of March, a target of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to 26 to 28% below 2005 levels in 2025. And that target puts us, this is important, on a pathway consistent with achieving deep reductions of 80% or more by 2050, the level commonly expected from advanced economies, to hold expected warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. And a new agreement in Paris would be a historic step and establish for the first time an ambitious, durable climate agreement that applies to all countries, is fair, focuses both on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and building resilience, includes strong accountability measures, and ensures ongoing financial and technical assistance to those who need it. Second, next 20 years will require an even greater focus on law enforcement, especially with the European Union. A while ago I mentioned our bilateral relationship with member states. Here I'm talking about the European Union, specifically Europol, EU's law enforcement agency. And we already collaborate, for example, in cracking down on online child sexual exploitation, human smuggling, drug and weapons trafficking, and other serious transnational crime. And we have already been cooperating closely with Europol on the terrorist finance tracking program, an essential tool to combat terrorism, while also looking for ways to stem the tide of foreign fighters from Europe and the United States into conflict zones in their return. And we have to look at ways to improve our collaboration on cybersecurity and cybercrime. Third, when we signed the new transatlantic agenda, issues of migration and asylum were handled by EU member states and were barely mentioned. Now, EU laws and institutions take an increasingly important role on these issues, as you know. As the EU crafts a coordinated approach to the current migration crisis, the United States has an opportunity to partner with the EU to share our own experiences as a country with a long history of weaving migrants and refugees into the fabric of our own society. Fourth, over the next 20 years, the U.S.-EU partnership needs to focus on combating the scourge of corruption, mentioned briefly in the document 20 years ago. It is a root cause of alienation and anger around the world, often exploding into conflict and violent extremism. The transatlantic partnership needs to do more to support democracies around the world and to prevent the efforts of external powers to subvert our own democracies at home. And there were a few areas in the document 20 years ago that received very scant attention. Don't have time to mention all of them, but I'll mention just two. One, military cooperation, barely mentioned. It's actually a rather significant part of my responsibilities here today. And by that I mean cooperation between the Department of Defense and the EU military staff, in Africa particularly, where there's absolute logic behind our supporting the various military missions in Africa. And I think we're going to have a few things to announce on that score. Also, the exchange of confidential military information between the United States Armed Forces and the EU military staff, again, in Africa, starting there. The second point is, I wanted to talk about a little bit more. It's the digital economy. Of course, 20 years ago, we barely had the internet. Now, 20 years ago, this is a major issue, and it's not surprising that when you look at the plan for this commission, Juncker's plan, the digital single market is an absolutely core pillar. It's intended to create the regulatory market conditions to help companies to innovate, collaborate, invest, create jobs, drive growth, while better serving customers. And it's a vision we support, despite a lot of the press narratives that somehow we're against it. Cross-border data flows between the US and Europe are already the highest in the world, and with the rapid growth in mobile computing, the advent of the Internet of Things, big data analytics, cloud computing, those flows are projected to increase substantially, not surprisingly. Technology can and must be part of the solution to some of the challenges I've mentioned: climate change, migration, corruption, radicalization, you name it. And we don't know what new technologies will develop in the coming years, but we do know, however, that how we coordinate now on these issues will determine whether we end up building incompatible regulatory frameworks that stunt growth, that harm growth, or instead are able to harness the promise of new technologies for the good of Americans and Europeans alike. Transatlantic collaboration, not only government to government, but among researchers, policymakers, academics, civil society, is essential to build a strong foundation for the future. And that brings me to my final point. Perhaps the most important part of that document, not talked about very often, is building bridges across the Atlantic. The Fulbright-Schumann program is one way the United States and the European Union have supported such people-to-people exchanges. And the first exchanges took place nearly 25 years ago, set in motion by the Transatlantic Declaration in 1990. Since then, over 350 American and European academics, researchers, mid-career professionals have benefited from this exchange program. And the program has allowed them to spend up to 9 months with their peers on the other side of the Atlantic, returning home with new perspectives on their field and on the transatlantic partnership. The College of Europe has long been an important partner for Fulbright-Schumann. One of your professors here, Michelle Chang, is an alumna of the program. I'm not sure is she here. Well, she's one of the alumni of the program. We're very proud of that. And now is the time to take the Fulbright-Schumann program to the next level. And that's why I'm proud to announce the launch of a new joint initiative, the Fulbright-Schumann Innovation Grants. And these grants are designed to support researchers and mid-career professionals who work at the intersection of technology and policy, allowing for a transatlantic approach to harnessing the potential of new technologies. Our inaugural group of innovation grant recipients will focus on data privacy. But future years may focus on issues such as cyber security, healthcare, or issues that we have not even thought of today. We need the best young minds of Europe and the United States to focus on these issues. You're the ones who can build these bridges now and throughout your careers. And if you take one thing from my remarks today, this is it. The Transatlantic Partnership is not just about words on a few pages of a 20-year-old document. It's relevant, I feel it's vital, I live it every day. It's constantly adapting, but it is based on shared values, much talked about, but still very relevant. And it has the potential to make a positive impact on every, and I mean every global challenge we face today. I didn't have time to talk about all of them, but I live through this every day. Every global challenge, the United States looks to Europe, including the EU, as its partner. I have not seen a pivot to Asia. If someone can tell me how we pivot to Asia, I want to hear about it during the reception. Each one of you has a role to play in strengthening and broadening that partnership. Thanks very much.